Good afternoon and welcome to Community Candor. We are so excited to have you join us today, and this session on Community Candor is entitled Building New Housing, How Does It Work? This session and this series is hosted by Communities First, Inc., and we have a great panel with us today. We're going to introduce them in just a moment. I just want to share with you, if you are with us live, feel free to post your questions and comments in the chat, and we will be referring to those throughout. So without further ado, let's go ahead and kick off with introductions. And I'll go ahead and start with Monique Becker.
Thanks, Renee. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Monique Becker, and I am co-founder of Mona Lisa Development. We are a real estate development and construction firm, and we are actually in our third year of operations now, so can definitely share more about kind of getting up a real estate and construction business, from the ground up. We focus mostly on residential renovations at a neighborhood scale. Although in my past, I've also worked for larger developers on projects ranging from 23 units adaptive reuse all the way to 230 units with the 330 space parking garage. My sweet spot though, and what I really have a passion for, is that neighborhood scale development that just, everyday people can do. And in that, I'm also the manager of program implementation for Building Community Value, which is a nonprofit in the city that teaches residents of Detroit, Hamtramck, and Highland Park how to do development in their communities. So yeah, really excited to be a part of this conversation with the other panelists and CFI today.
We are excited to have you, and we'll want to make sure that we share that link in the chat with folks if they are interested in learning more about how to do development in their communities. So Richard Hosey.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Richard Hosey. I'm the owner of Hosey Development. 9 years ago, I went full-time into development and focusing on multifamily primarily, with sometimes a base of office and retail at the ground level. My projects have been in downtown and midtown and the Live 6 corridor so far. And my background is grew up and was born and raised in Detroit, went away, worked for developers and consultants, and finally a stint with a large bank investing in urban development, and decided to go full time 9 years ago. In that time, I've completed 4 projects, and I have 3 under construction and 1 in pre-development now.
Thank you, Richard. And Michael Wright.
Thanks, Renee. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Wright. I'm the Vice President of Real Estate Development at Communities First, Inc. So I'm basically working all aspects of real estate development, from looking for sites and projects to all the way to completion, lease up, and even some asset management. I've been doing real estate development since 2009. Starting out in the incentives world, helping other developers and nonprofits and even some for-profit find gap financing and structure transformational real estate development projects, from large-scale, projects to smaller community projects that impact a neighborhood. I'm happy to be here and answer questions and listen to what the other panelists have to say.
Happy to have you on with us. So we've got a very experienced panel. I'm very excited about this conversation. I'll just quickly introduce myself. I am your co-moderator, Renee Kent, Director of Special Projects at Communities First, and have a background in banking, particularly finance for community development projects across the state of Michigan. And I'll turn it over to my co-host, Joel Arnold, to introduce himself and carry on with the program.
Thanks so much, Renee. And everyone, my name's Joel Arnold. I'm the Planning and Advocacy Coordinator here at Communities First. I'm a city planner and have been working in community development for about the last 7 years. And I'm excited about this conversation that we're going to have today. And so this is really a second in a 4-part series of this community candor session around housing and city planning. And so over the course of this series of conversations, we're trying to dive really deep into housing issues in our communities. In our initial conversations, we talked about what kinds of housing there are, very basic level, what kinds of housing do we see get developed. In future conversations, we want to talk about how do we make sure that housing is equitably delivered and that we are free of discrimination in our housing markets, and also how we can plan holistically for the kinds of communities that everybody wants to live in. So you can find our previous conversations on Facebook and YouTube. But today we want to drill into a key aspect of development that I think is known very well by people on our panel here, but often not by just our neighbors in the community, which is the development process itself, right? What does it take to actually get new housing units built? And what is that process like for different kinds of projects, right? It's very different to build multifamily apartments or townhomes than it may be to renovate a single family home or to build a new single family home. So we want to make sure to have those conversations because we hear those come up a lot in neighborhood conversations, whether it's in Flint or in Detroit or in Lansing or in Gary, where we do all our work at Communities First. And so we thought this was a great opportunity to really dive into these things. So I will allow Renee to ask the first question here, and then we'll kind of go back and forth as we proceed over the next, 53 minutes of hopefully some really illuminating conversation. So Renee, please do go ahead.
Thank you, Joel. And while I'm asking this question, I know we have a slide that's going to come up for Mike's response. But Mike, could you begin by sharing with us briefly what the development process entails from acquiring land all the way to the ribbon cutting? What does that look like?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. One that gets asked a lot. Seems to be a lot of mystery around it somewhat. I'll first share that the process is not this straightforward, as well as it takes, a lot of time, anywhere from 1 year. Some projects take 5 years or more. Some of these steps can happen before other steps, just depending on what is going on. But typically you start out with a development concept. You have to find, where is the land and is that land available? What's your project and who's going to live there? Or in the case of commercial or industrial or whatnot, who's going to use that building or project or site? Just a quick little, I guess not a story, but a quick little thing that we had recently on a project. There's a lot of questions. We were developing a site near a downtown, and a lot of questions from certain people about why are you building there when there's a site 3 blocks away? Why not just build on this site? Because we might want to see that project over here rather than right where you're putting it. So the key question is that land available? So, where's the project? Where are you going to put it? I might want to put it in downtown New York City in Times Square. Is that available? Probably not. So, is there funding for that project in this location? So that's a key concept. Is you really have to balance those things. The next thing is, you have your concept, you have your location, your project. Will people live here? How much are they going to pay? They're going to pay different rent in different places. How do you find out what they're going to pay and if they'll live there? You look at the market, you look at other apartments, commercial spaces, amenities. What are the occupancy rates? If you have an apartment building next door, across the street, or is it a similar project? Maybe if you don't have any examples in your market, you can look at another market with similar attributes. So that's something that you can do. So if you kind of start to answer those questions, you look at the site that you're looking at, and there's certain constraints. How big is the site? What's the zoning? Will the government allow me to build it? Do I want to, maybe I have a market for 150 units, but the zoning only allows me to build 25 units. What can I do? And maybe I can build 40 if I get a variance. Sometimes there's room there. So you have to find those things out. And so if you can get, who's going to live there, how much they're going to pay, maybe what I'm going to be allowed to build within a certain range. Then I need to find out, well, how much is that going to cost to build? And you can get some estimates. You can use your own experience in that. So you get the cost, then you start looking at the operations of the building and estimating, well, I kind of know what people are going to pay. How am I going to, what are people going to, what is it going to cost me to run the building? How much are utilities going to be? Are residents going to pay utilities? How much is management? How much is it going to cost to maintain the building? What reserves am I going to have? So you get your operating, your income and expenses. Once you have those, you have money left over, hopefully. Can you use some of that money to go out and get a loan? And what size loan can I get? So that leads us into the sources and uses. If I have my costs, then I say, well, I can afford a loan of a certain amount. How much is it? What are my other costs to build? Not just construction, but my architect or my other fees. There's a lot of different fees. And since we're at an estimating stage, we want a contingency. What's appropriate size contingency? How realistic are we going to be? Are we going to be too conservative where it's not feasible? We want to strike a balance there. Once we have this information, I think we're ready now to talk to some financing partners. What are we going to do as our sources? We have a loan. Do we go out and find an investor? Perhaps we can give them a rate of return. So they want to invest a certain amount in the project up front. And we'll say, well, we're going to cash flow this much money. So we'll give you a part of that cash flow. Don't forget the developer gets paid last. So part of it is, it seems so cool to do these projects, but you got to pay the contractor, you got to pay the architect, you got to pay all the professionals, you got to pay your loan, you got to pay everything. And then once all that's done, hopefully there's money left over that you can pay yourself. And that way you can maybe go out and do another project. So you kind of have that information internally. You can talk to some partners and find out rates, and you go on, well, I have my permanent financing. That's what that's called, my end financing once I build the project. But what happens when I'm building the project? How do I pay for that? Because my contractor is going to start building, and he's going to want money to pay his people. He's going to want it next month. He's going to want it in 3 months. And my bank says, I'm going to give you $1 million when the project's done, but how do I pay him during construction? Where am I going to get that money? So I have to figure that out. You can get construction loan. You can pay it out of your own pocket. Other different sources, but you need to figure that out as well. All the while, you need to figure out the next step, entitlements. Don't forget this process is, all these steps can run together. So, you're talking with the city, you have your plan, that you have it zoned properly, or you need to get some kind of permission to do something that's outside the rules. And maybe you think you can do that. So you can go to the planning commission or city council or whoever. And that can be a months long to a year long process. Hopefully you're building community support. That build community support in that step should actually go back to, even the first step. You should already have some of that going, so that people can come out and support your project. So you go through that process, and hopefully you can get your site plan approval, your zoning permit, all that good stuff. The next step, or one of the steps, is then you have your agreements. You have your loan documents with your lender. If you have an investor, you have an agreement with your investor, so you negotiate those terms. Don't be afraid to ask for what you want or what you need. The worst they can say is no. One thing that I'll share with you that I find interesting in this world is when I talk to people, banks, whoever, they say, well, we don't do that because that's not our standard practice. Well, there's no standard practice. You can ask for it and they can say no, or they can, negotiate, but there's not, just because someone did something the way they've always done it doesn't mean they're going to do it that way again, or they have to do it that way. So don't be afraid for asking for flexibility in negotiating all your agreements. So once you get that locked in, you're going to work toward closing on that financing and funding. You're going to work on finalizing your building plans and finalizing your permits, and start, fund your and start construction. Once you move, you're going to go through the construction process, monitoring your contractor, monitoring progress, making sure things are going smoothly. And hopefully you're going to get to construction completion. Your contractor is going to say, we're done, pay us now. And we're going to say, hold on a sec. Do you have a certificate of occupancy from the city? And they're going to say, yeah, here you go, or no, but I'm not going to pay you until you get that. So you get that certificate of occupancy, and you yourself are also going to want to walk through the building and make sure that all the plugs are in the right spot, all the countertops in the right spot. They didn't put a garbage disposal switch in the bathroom. They don't have the intercom to the front door in your bedroom, all that kind of stuff. Make sure everything's built to how you want it. If it's not, if there's paint missing, if there's something like that, it's your responsibility to make them fix it, because once they get paid, they're less likely to do that. So make sure everything is complete up to your standards and your quality, because it's ultimately your project. It's not the bank's project. It's not the contractor's. It's yours. You're the final, the buck stops with you. But hopefully you've got to that completion stage, and now you have, you're ready to lease up. So you either yourself, or if you have a property manager, get them to start leasing up the units and get to occupancy, full occupancy as quickly as possible. And then you have what I think of as in three terms is lease up, which is getting the units rented, occupancy, which is they're occupied, fully occupied. And then once you have that, you're in the stabilization period, which just means that you are now fully functioning, operational. Everything should be going smoothly. And then the final step is, to monitor and make sure you're fully complying with everything, all your financial agreements, any agreements you have with the city. And then ultimately you have a life cycle cost or life cycle of the building. You're going to renovate or you're going to sell. You renovate in 15 years, something like that. Or potentially, you might want to sell when we don't, Communities First doesn't do that, doesn't sell. We own and we maintain, but you kind of want to pay attention to that, and just you're tracking now and making sure everything's running smoothly. So that in a nutshell is the development process. I might have missed a lot of stuff, but I think overall, globally, that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Mike. So that was a lot of information. And I encourage anyone in the audience that has any questions, if you heard a term that you're not familiar with, or if you want to know a little bit more about something that Mike mentioned, please put it in the chat, and we will address those questions as we move throughout. And if you're interested in getting a copy of that slide, please complete the survey. So there's a link in the chat, and throughout the presentation, we'll show it on screen. So again, if you want a copy of that slide, make sure you fill out the survey. It also is helpful to us when you fill out the survey, so we know if the information that we're providing is useful, or if there are other topics that you're interested in learning more about. So thanks again, Mike. And moving on to Richard, I'm wondering if you can provide a little insight related to the multifamily building process. Are there some unique characteristics that you have to think about when you're going through that development process and cycle if you're working on a multifamily project?
So one of the things I really liked about, so thank you. And sorry, I lost my connection briefly. But one of the things I really liked about Mike's process chart is that, and development in general, is that it really is scalable. So his process chart really works for developments of all sizes. And what essentially happens, or what feels unique, is I guess you get more oversight as you get into larger and larger and larger projects. But the expectation is that you already know all those steps, and they're just there to oversee what you are already doing. So as you build expertise, there's an expectation that you can do it at larger and larger scales. And so it really is about looking at Mike's chart and getting more and more proficient at each of those steps, so that that you're able to scale that. One of the things that as you get into larger and larger projects, that does come, especially after you leave essentially the community, the CDFI loan world, because your project's larger than what they loan, is things get more cash intensive. There's an expectation that you will have ample cash at all times to solve all problems. And so banks get into this idea of liquidity requirements, which I always describe to people as just spare cash that you are not using for your business. And they have an expectation that it creates a barrier that you have to prepare for, so you could have all the expertise to leap to that next level of projects. And you see this with contractors and developers, but until you have that liquidity, that cash sitting off on the side, that's not used for your traditional business, only to solve problems, then the banks won't allow you to leap to those larger projects. And so your developments have to not just sustain you, they actually have to build your liquidity so that you can continue to add on.
Thank you, Richard. That's a great point. And so, in thinking about that, if you have a large development that you're working towards, you may need to bring in a partner, right? Someone to act as the guarantor or bring that additional liquidity to the table if you're still in the building process. And there's a question that just came in the chat, wondering about for local nonprofits, what's the best way for them to connect to mentorship opportunities. And so we go back to that partnership, partnering with, local developers like Richard Hosey and others, as well as Communities First. We're a nonprofit organization, but we partner with developers and nonprofits, as well as providing mentorship, looking at assets in the community that need to be developed. And then Monique, you can talk more about building community values as well, and the work that you're doing to help people. Because I'm about to ask you a question, and so you can incorporate that into or after your answer. But Monique, I'm wondering if you can, talk about the process as it relates to single-family housing or rehabs in the community and the whole development cycle, if there's anything unique.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great, process chart that Michael shared, and we actually have something similar in our course pack. Like Richard said, no matter the scale, it follows a similar path. It's just, changes in dollar amount, basically, and number of units. But, it always does start with that idea, the vision. In building community value, a lot of times we describe the developer as the conductor of an orchestra. So someone who is needing to manage all of these moving pieces that are required in order to bring the project to fruition, bring it to market. But, and you need to have some level of expertise in all of them, but it is really common for developers to bring on consultants to support their work. You have your accountants. You may have someone who, is consulting to focus specifically on the pro forma or, helping to build the capital stack. So, it really does follow that same pattern, no matter the scale. I think, with a lot of single family or, 2-family renovations, you might not need an architect, especially if you're not doing any big material changes or shifting walls or anything structural. So that's kind of an area where you can often save costs. But again, not always, depending on your vision and the level of rehab that you want to do. And, we are really fortunate here in Detroit to have a good ecosystem that helps to get people knowledge on development. So we typically look at building community value as a starting block. Smaller scale really helps people to utilize the resources that they have already to be able to begin, to build up their net worth, build generational wealth through accumulating homes, while being able to transition to larger scale projects. And once folks, are able to build up a portfolio of projects or experience, then a lot of times, they're at a larger scale, and then the capital impact partners, Equitable Development Initiative, is kind of a more appropriate place for them to go after. And a lot of times we get folks referred to us from capital impact because people want to start out with the big project, something that's flashy and seems really exciting, but there are real, structural barriers. And so it's, important if you have an inclination for development to start with what you have and start where you can. And, I dropped the BCV link in the chat, but I'm not sure if that went out to the group or if that was just our private chat.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll definitely make sure that we put that in the chat for the audience.
All right. Well, so the next question here that we want to talk about, and this is going to be to you, Monique, is Mike had a bit there in his slide, in his chart, that talked about financing, right? But financing, I think, is something that is often a bit of a black hole for a lot of people when it comes who aren't in real estate development. Of how do these things get actually financed and put together? So what we're wondering, if you can share, is how complex can financing be on these projects? I think a lot of people who may purchase a home just think, it's a mortgage from a bank, and you proceed with that and you purchase it. But in real estate development, that can be a lot more complicated. And if you can maybe share too a little bit of what is the normal breakdown of when you actually do get all that money together, how much of that is going to planning and architects, and how much of that is going to your contractors on site, and how much is going to the city for fees for building inspections. So whatever sort of insight you can share with us on that.
Yep. So I'll speak at a smaller scale, and then let Richard or Michael talk about the more complex deals. But on, let's say, a two-family flat, which is, again, what we talk about a lot in building community value, this like house hack idea, where you live in one unit and then you rent out the other unit. This is a good starting place for a lot of folks, because you can get owner-occupied financing. Typically, banks will fund at owner-occupied interest rates, which are significantly lower than investment properties, 1 to 4 units. So that becomes a really good starting point, because you can essentially live for free and also begin, to generate some investment revenue. And so that's a great starting point. Once you transition into, strictly investment properties and needing construction loans, unfortunately, the ecosystem locally is not very robust at this smaller scale. We at Mona Lisa have had luck working with Opportunity Resource Fund, which is a local community development financing institution, on a construction loan. Typically, they give loans for, fix and then sell. However, we also maintain our properties and rent them out. And so that means that we have to refinance the construction loan. And so we actually just closed on a refinance with Kiavi, which I would recommend folks looking into. Again, we kind of exhausted a lot of local options at that smaller scale. And so Kiavi is a national company, really large. The customer service isn't the best, but, we closed, and so, it works. So there's some options. They are limited, again, in terms of like soft costs, like professional fees versus hard costs or construction costs. On the smaller scale, you're really going to want to try to keep your soft costs as low as possible. And most of the money is going to be going to construction. And also, typically at that smaller scale, you'll be bringing your own equity to the table. And that could be equity that you've gotten from investors as well. But typically, it's just going to be like your equity and then the bank loan. You may have some miscellaneous grants or whatever in there, but the capital stack at the smaller scale is pretty straightforward. Unlike the work that Richard and Michael are doing on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, well, with that great segue, Richard, maybe if you can share just a little bit, what does that financing look like? We know that you're involved in projects with hundreds of units in them. So how can that financing break out?
Right. So yeah, it's one, I love Monique's house hack, because that is a great way to kind of get in there. And it's wonderful when you get something like 97% financing from FHA or something along those lines. As the projects get larger, all that oversight I talked about comes into play. There's interest reserves and sometimes very large legal fees, and they want to see all of the soft costs in the budget. That oversight wants to see every single line item cataloged and planned for. So my projects, I tend to see 70 to 80% of the budget going towards construction costs, and the rest really being soft costs, legal fees, building permits, certainly an interest reserve. They'll want to see operating and debt service reserves and plans for lease up. And so it gets a lot more, kind of complicated, and making sure, well, it's all the steps that any project is going to have. They just want to see them, clearly enunciated and planned for, estimated, and you'll be held to those. So the capital stack, if you're outside of an urban area, you're just, building in, the middle of Birmingham, then it probably looks a lot like Monique's, right? There's a loan and there's the equity, and where you get that equity. Inside of urban areas, there tends to be programs based upon kind of historically that move out to the suburbs. People trying to do those kind of turn around the history of the exit. So there are specific programs, and you're trying to fit within those. When you get outside of that and start looking for some extraordinary new thing for a city or state to do for you, then you're in a whole heavier lift. So, but there are off the shelf things. There's the brownfield, if you're in Michigan, brownfield tax increment financing, whereby the state helps with some of the environmental costs that based on kind of projects that were built a while ago having environmental contamination. There's the community revitalization program designed to work inside of cities, be they rural cities or the larger cities, and with specific requirements. And so you find yourself trying to put together all of these pieces to reduce that equity requirement, because inside the cities, generally in the early stages, and as you go into each neighborhood, your appraised value is going to be less than your development costs. And so that's that gap that Mike was talking about, looking for those gap fillers. And so when you're spending $100 million to build something and it's going to be worth $80 million afterwards, then someone might initially say, why would you ever do that? But it's that broader impact that's there. And you look such that down the road, that will actually flip, and you'll get where you actually build for value. And so those programs are there to kind of assist and incentivize people to develop in certain areas. Getting the expertise and cobbling together those programs is a big key. And so that's where developers on their financing stacks really start focusing. How do you learn how to quickly put those programs together, look at a project, know what type of incentives are already there to make it viable, to close that difference between the 80 and the 100, and so that now you're back down to a traditional, it works after incentives process. And so we put a lot of focus there. And in the end, particularly in the city of Detroit now, there's a real strong push to say you have to make sure that you have an ample amount of developer cash in there so that you're invested in at risk. And that number is usually, I think, between 5 and 10% of the total development cost. And that provides it provides some barriers, but it also provides some real incentive to focus on doing things really well.
Yeah, and I think, one thing that we're really aware of, and like Mike mentioned earlier, that you can have these large 10, 20, 30, $100 million projects, but oftentimes, right, the developer is getting paid last out of that. And so it's a slice of that goes to the developer, but most of that, right, is going to contractors, fees, permits, and all those other kind of costs.
No, that's a great point. That's a really great point. So I tell people, really think about real estate development as what is going to provide for your next generation, because it's really slow returns. When I tell people, on a very large deal, you're still expecting the cash to the developer after paying for loans and cost and maintenance and everything to be about in the early years $200 per unit per month. And so you'll see this huge project and think, oh, that must be throwing off a ton of money. And it's just not, because you have these massive loans, you have all these operating costs, and that grows over time. In the same way that a single family home that you buy 30 years ago it was a struggle to hold at first, and 30 years later, it's this wonderful asset. It really is a long-term investment.
All right. Well, I'll pass it back over to Renee to take us on to the next.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm going to ask Mike a question. But before I do that, I just want to make Richard and Monique aware that after Mike answers that, I'm going to punt to you guys to share your experience with doing your first construction housing project in Detroit. So be prepared. So you can think about that for a minute. Mike, I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the difference between doing a new construction development versus a rehab on a vacant structure.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, there's some differences in costs, but overall, if you look at you have a vacant building versus a clean, whatever, new site or you're going to do new construction on, you have to look at the condition of the building. Is it in, a good condition? Is it in poor condition? Is it a historic building? Is it, even if it's not historic, because that's going to come with a whole nother set of requirements. If you would want to seek some financing incentives or not, it's still going to, you might have to pass through a historic district commission in order to do your plan. SHPO, which is the State Historic Preservation Office, is going to have a say in what you're doing. And also NPS, National Park Service, which has an arm that's dedicated to historic preservation, will likely have a say. Even if it's not historic, but let's say we just completed a rehab of a apartment building in Flint that was vacant since probably the late 90s. We looked into it because we are at heart preservationists, but we're also feasibility-ists, which means that we want the project to get done and want it to be feasible and sustainable. This building, it's a mid-century modern, really cool building. Determined that it doesn't have any historic value according to these standards, right? So it's not really eligible for incentives, but it does have, from what we consider, what the community considers historic features, right? Mid-century modern, really cool looking building. So we want to preserve that. So we have to, we want to get an architect, contractor, really develop this with intention, rehab this with intention of preserving these features. If there's new windows, so the new window is going to fit. There's a community, there's neighbors. Is it in a historic district? Those neighbors are going to have a say. You're going to want to communicate with them and get their needs. So that's the condition. Is it historic? Is it your lender especially, but yourself is going to want, is the structure good? That goes to the condition. What part of the building can actually be reused? Same project. A lot of the building was beautifully preserved on the structure, but the inside, a lot of that framing that we thought could be reused couldn't. And talk about unexpected things. This hit right when the price of lumber went up 200%. All right, and all of a sudden we have to get all this framing that we didn't think we would have to get. Lead and asbestos, if it's built before 79. I can't remember the exact years, but it's built before a certain year, it's probably going to have lead. It's built before like 86 or something, it's probably going to have asbestos. You're going to want to get that inspected. You're going to have to get that remediated. We did a school project where when later on in the project, they figured out they had to drill holes to pass conduit through and they didn't think they would. Our contractor couldn't touch that because it was abated or remediated, but not abated, which just means that they're encapsulated versus abated. You hear those terms. Encapsulated means it's covered, it's fine, it's not going to be messed with. Abated means you pull it out, right? Certain things get abated, certain things get encapsulated. Well, if we have to change anything, you have to get an actual abatement contractor whose license is going to be able to do that, and it's going to cost more to just drill a hole. So that's a concern. In a vacant building, you're going to have an already existing building, our existing layout. What walls can you move? What walls can't you move? So that affects your construction costs, right? So you need a larger contingency with a vacant building. Is the building going to be a change in use, adaptive reuse? Adaptive reuse just means that you're going from one type of use, say office, to another type, residential. Or are you keeping an apartment building an apartment building? That's a concern. What are you doing with it? Banks, lenders, investors, everyone wants to know your experience. Do you know what you're getting into with this building? Because of the unknowns, the higher contingency, but also you have to be able to cope with things that might happen. New construction, you have same considerations as far as site, right? Is there environmental contamination? What's the size of the site? But you can pretty much put a building anywhere, and you can choose your layout within the constraints that we already discussed about zoning and things like that. You have ability to customize your layout. So new construction, you also know what building you're building. You know all the materials, you know the whole design, you know everything about it. So it's a little bit easier on that end. So that's sort of some of the high level differences on those.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, that's so important. Doing a rehab, you have to expect the unexpected, because once you get behind walls, it's not just about slapping paint on there and making it look pretty. You're going to find something always. So I appreciate that. So we have a question that came in the chat, and someone in the audience is very interested in hearing from Richard and Monique about your takeaways from your first new construction housing project in the city of Detroit. So I'll open the floor, whoever wants to start first.
Sure. So for my first new construction project, one of the interesting things was, kind of how those constraints come together that Mike was just talking about, but also kind of the environmental of dealing with dirt. And so it's so one of the incentives when you're, in the state of Michigan is tied to there being some environmental contamination of the dirt. And so you're almost looking for some, right? You're looking for some, but not too much. And so this, finding how to kind of weave that process, getting into, all of the things that are associated with pouring a foundation, having a building sitting on that, how strong is your dirt? Are you sitting on clay? So you get into all these things that I take it for granted, doing historic rehab. So I really love historic buildings, both for their architecture, but also for the unlimited 20% federal historic tax credit incentive that's associated with doing them. But one of the things I take it for granted is that I already had a foundation poured, and I already had and it was sitting on top of dirt, and it had been sitting on top of that dirt for 100 years, and I didn't have to worry about kind of what was under that building. And so, whereas with my new construction project, we really got into, what's going on in this dirt. It's for a very long time when buildings were knocked down in cities, they just dumped them in the hole and put enough dirt over it that nothing would come up over time. But it's still down there. And so that type of contamination, making sure that you find it before you get your construction finances so you can put it in the budget. That was a big deal. So and your phase one may very well not show it. So we had so the first part of the environmental is a phase one that says, do you expect anything bad to be in this dirt? And our phase one said no. But we could see there was an area where trees weren't growing, and it was pretty obvious. And so and because they had dumped the prior building that they tore down in the 50s down in there, and so we went and did soil borings and found that building was down there, and we were able to incorporate that into the budget up front. If we had gone with the initial phase one and said everything's fine and clean, then we would have found that building after construction, and that's a whole different problem once your budget is set and now you're trying to add money, because that comes directly out the developer's pocket.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to that, another one of the big unexpected costs that seemed to be forever moving target was DTE fees for new service and bringing lines, and who's responsible for that, and underground, above ground. And so it just, when you're doing the new construction, to Richard's point of pouring the foundation, you really have to do a lot more site prep, and you have to make sure you can get all the utilities, to the building. That's going to be an additional cost that in rehabs you typically don't have. Sometimes you may have some costs. but there are kind of some bigger unknowns that you just need to be aware of. And Tanya, happy to chat offline if you have any more specific questions. But I think we're a little bit short on time, so I'll leave it at that.
That's wonderful. And yeah, thank you for folks making comments in the chats online. Please keep getting those in, and we'll keep asking our panelists of them. We have a lot of experience and intellect here on this, so let's make sure to ask those questions while you can. So the next question that I want to ask, and this will go to all three of you, but it's sort of a two-parter. You could do any kind of project, or you could be interested in any kind of project, but most developers choose, certain types of projects or are known for types of projects. And so what I'm wondering is, how do you decide the kinds of projects that you undertake? And knowing that housing happens in the context of a community, can you kind of share what role that community need plays and how you try to engage the community in your work? So I'm going to start with Mike, and I'll ask Richard and Monique as well.
So I think the first thing is kind of like, what is your pipeline? What is what's your kind of wheelhouse? Like, what kind of development do you do, right? You do single family, you do multifamily, industrial, whatever it is. And so you have kind of that type of development that you're primarily doing. Maybe it's a couple different types. And then you have a certain, like a pipeline of projects which a pipeline is just, you have a list of projects that maybe you're on your radar that you're working on at once. And then it's sort of like what opportunities are coming up to be able to kind of go to the next step, right? You're in that development process flow chart that I went through earlier. You might have 4, 5, 10, whatever projects at different stages. I might have site plan approval on a project, but I don't have maybe gap financing. I might be waiting on gap financing and kind of have that iron in the fire, and it might come out 3 months later. Or I might be waiting on an application or an award or a bank to review something. So at that point, I might get that back, and then I can go to that next stage. So it's sort of a bit like having enough irons in the fire to basically be ready when the opportunity presents itself. And as far as engaging with the community, it's a continual circular process of engaging on each project of what you're doing, and with the neighborhood organizations, the city, and it's also framing the need, right? You can think that we have people explain things. Well, we're putting low income housing here. Well, now the term is affordable. It's not low income, right? And being able to communicate what the needs are in a way that people can understand it, and be able to frame and educate people on the planning commission, city council members, neighborhood organizations, members of the general public, that from the data that you have to the project that you're doing and how you're solving problems with your project on a level that they can understand, and then hopefully become advocates for you.
That's great. Well, I'll go to Richard next. Yeah, if you just want to share, the kinds of projects that you tend to be interested in, and how you decide on those, and then how you engage the community.
So thanks. So it's early in my career, 25 years ago, I started at a historic rehab developer, and that really got me stuck on that. It became my passion. First, I liked the numbers. I like the kind of the historical part of entering cities in an early time and helping redevelop them, and then I grew an appreciation for the architecture and kind of what it brings that you can't replicate, and developing that as a passion and then as an expertise. I look for that in what I'm going to use as my next project. I will do new construction and those type of things. I've done it before, but I'm generally doing that as an add-on to some historic rehab. And so my way of engaging in the community is saying, if I'm looking for a project that fits my passion and that neighborhood's needs, then we're going to have this kind of common point of interest to engage, right? So So, if I'm just kind of putting whatever is necessary there and I'm kind of okay, or what I would like to have there, then we can have more conflicts. Whereas if I enter a neighborhood and they're like, we got this big old building that is vacant and we would love to see rehab, and I say, that's what I do. That's my expertise. And so now we have something that we can jointly get passionate about. And so by following my passions and seeing where it's going to be helpful and needed, then that eases my community process every time. And it also has this benefit of the more people are behind the idea, the more it's needed in that area, then the easier it is to get support for solutions. And so I like to get to a neighborhood early when there's still need, when there's still, and it looks like there's higher risk because there's more support.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, of course, yeah, communities first. We also love and have a passion for historic preservation. So it's always so cool to see those projects. And we know you have some very exciting ones coming up as well. So Monique, yeah, same question to you.
Yeah. So, when I think of community, it's kind of in terms of the neighborhood community, like geographic, or also like community of people, maybe shared interests or identities. So, when we were first starting with Mona Lisa, we focused on all of our homes that we bought within our neighborhood, so that we had a, community of neighbors who kind of knew what we were doing, could help us to keep an eye out on the properties. We never had any theft issues. We think that was a big part of it. Also being able to work with neighbors, particularly on these smaller scales. And then also when we think about like community of people in terms of like our target market, we typically, rent to creatives, community builders, entrepreneurs. So folks just like us. And so it became very easy to kind of know what the need is and what folks were looking for in terms of housing, and really, especially with a lot of the artist community, understanding the need for, affordable rent, and the desire to also share space and community with others kind of on that similar grind. And so, again, like we focus more geographically on our neighborhood. And then other ways that we've kind of like done community engagement to, ensure that we are staying connected with our community besides, like porch conversations and running into each other on the street is, we host annual parties. Like during Memorial Day weekend, we have a huge event at one of our spaces that neighbors come to, and a host of other folks. And then we also have like annual yard sales where we raise funds to improve some community lots. So just, really being like boots on the ground has helped us to have a strong, source of support within our community. And in terms of like passion projects, like Mona Lisa, it's my baby. It's what we do. So it's all the passion, and we really see ourselves as not only kind of creating housing or hospitality experiences, but really that we're like making art to be lived in. So we take extreme pride in the design and being creative and resourceful with it. And so anytime there's vacant land, or most commonly, a building or something that we want to rehab, just looking at, how do we create an experience that we would enjoy, that our community would enjoy, and where we can really, get involved and get our hands dirty on the construction side as the GC. And yeah, it's really fun. If anyone is interested in development, definitely look up, building community value and capital impact. There's a bunch of people in this ecosystem like myself and Richard who are always trying to help people to get connected with doing this work.
Thank you. Definitely appreciate the time that you all have committed to sharing this wealth of information and these resources with the audience. I just want to, we have another question, but I just want to just plug again for the audience, if you haven't already, please take a second to fill out that survey. It'll be in the chat, and I think we'll probably scroll it on the screen again, but please fill that out. That way we can share that slide that was shown earlier. And also, we love to get your feedback on these sessions. And so there have been a lot of great resources and tips that have been shared throughout this. The importance of engaging the community because you want the community to be your advocate, not your adversary when you're trying to do development. That dirt can be complicated. You don't know what's underneath that. There's all kinds of environmental surprises that can appear. And not only the dirt when you're doing new construction, but if you're working on an existing structure, you don't know what's behind the walls until you get in there. So just preparing for all of that. So I'm going to ask our panelists what advice you would give someone if they're just starting out or if they want to, start out in real estate or go to the next level. And so I'm going to ask Mike to share some of his final tips and wisdom to someone who's interested in real estate development.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, first, just don't be afraid to ask questions. As real estate developers, we're typically like generalists that deal with a lot of specialists, and you sort of have to live in both worlds in a lot of different ways. So, I don't want to say there's no such thing as a dumb question, because sometimes if you're in a public meeting, you feel like there are. But, just don't be afraid to ask questions when you're in a room with people. But at the same time, know your audience as well. Like, you're talking to a planning commission or a public body or whatever. There's differences, or you're writing a narrative to a grantor or a city commission or whatnot. But I'd say, the largest thing is don't be afraid to ask questions. That's how you learn. Don't be afraid to ask questions when you're talking to a bank. Why are you giving me a 4% interest rate when could you give me a 3% interest rate? So that's kind of, I think, the biggest takeaway or the biggest thing when you're starting out.
Thank you, Mike. And Richard.
Thanks. What I would think, so I think of development as, in a lot of ways, a self-apprenticeship, right? So no one starts out knowing even remotely all of it. And so you're constantly seeking that. So those asking questions, like Mike said, is a huge thing. But also, so many times the solution to problems in real estate is a monetary solution. And so I like for people to start out significantly smaller than they would like to start out, right? And so because there's so much to learn and so many bumps in the road along the way, and all of those bumps are solved financially, then look at something that you could easily manage financially, because it's such a stressful process that if you're already financially stressed, then that just adds to everything and takes away a lot of your options. And so knowing that it's such a long-term wealth building process, taking that first deal and doing it smaller and a little slower, and maximizing the learning as opposed to the economic value, it'll pay off tenfold down the road. And so it's it's kind of the opposite of what people generally like to do, because they're expected to get rich very quickly. But really start out with a smaller project than you believe you can handle.
Thank you, Richard. And to that point, I think both you and Mike made the suggestion that talking with people who are experienced, and those that are experienced, including everybody who's on the panel, is willing to have conversations with people who are starting out. So reaching out and asking questions and finding a mentor are highly recommended. And in the chat, we've included Monique's website. We've included Communities First, their website. And if you see Richard on the street, just grab him, because I know that he'll talk to you. But folks who are in this world, in this ecosystem, they're always willing to share some advice. And so, Monique, would you please share some final thoughts for our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Just echoing what was already said, start with what you have right now and at a scale that is appropriate for you, one that's not aspirational. You know, even the wealthiest, largest developers on the biggest projects start out in phases. So think of your development career trajectory as a phased development. You know, start where you are, and then by doing project by project, you'll be able to later at some graduated point be able to pursue those larger projects that really it wouldn't be feasible for you to do before without all of that experience beforehand.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that, Monique, and thank you, Mike, and to Richard, and for everybody who's joined us online. I know I've learned a lot in this conversation. I hope people who've been watching have learned a lot. And I want to remind everybody that our next session is going to be on April 28th at noon. And it's going to be called Equitable Housing, Ensuring Fairness. So today we got into the weeds of, right, how do we build these units? How do we get the financing? And our next conversation is how do we make sure that the units are being sold or rented equitably, that we don't see housing discrimination, and how do we make sure we're building a housing market that works for everybody, regardless of your race or class or gender. And so we're looking forward to that discussion where we'll have more wonderful panelists like we were fortunate enough to have today. But that's all that we have for now. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you all on the 28th at noon. And yeah, to Richard and Monique and Mike, thank you for taking an hour to talk with us here today. And the last thing too, fill out the survey that is in the chat. Get that survey filled out.
Thank you all. Appreciate you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.